We will now welcome James Mack. James is the Assistant Deputy Minister for Water, Fisheries, and Coastal Policy and Planning in the newly named Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. James has held previous ADM positions for Environment, Stewardship Policy, and Strategic Planning in the Ministry of Environment, and Agriculture and Science Policy in the Ministry of Agriculture. Prior to this, he served as head of the BC Climate Action Secretariat. So today, the discussion will include the mandate of the new Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship, some reflections on the Water Act, and how agricultural producers are being considered under this new stewardship mandate. So, welcome, James. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Well, and just scanning through, it looks like there's some familiar names on the list, so it's great to be with everyone today. I'm going to do a really short flyby just on the creation of the new ministry and the water mandate. And I'll probably try to keep that short and open it up because I'm sure a lot of the discussion with the interfaces with agriculture are probably better done, through the Q&A. So I'll just share my screen here. Just give the hamster a second to run the wheel on my computer. Okay, so as introduced, so new Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. If anyone was tracking up until December, we were the Ministry of Land, Water, and Resource Stewardship, but not a substantive change there, more of a stylistic change. But for those of us working on water issues, we're really championing that this is a big deal, that we're moving up in the real estate for the ministry. They, as I mentioned, I just wanted to give people a bit of a background because it is a new ministry on why that change was done. My mandate here is on water as well as fisheries and coastal policy and planning. So again, I'll give you a bit of a sense of what we're doing on water, but feel free to follow up with me on if you're interested in fisheries issues or on our coastal marine approaches, let me know. I will give you a sense of what's coming up and where there's some policy issues on the horizon, notably a watershed security strategy that's in development right now. But again, I'm really hoping, one is treat this like an introduction. So feel free to reach out to me after the event, but also we'll try to get a bit of a dialogue going in the time we've got. So just in terms of the creation of this new ministry. So one is a recognition that things are getting a lot more challenging to manage on the land base, right? One is from an economic perspective, the kind of demands that we're putting on our natural resources, but as well the environmental and the cultural imperatives. And in particular, the commitments we've made around reconciliation and the passage of the Declaration Act. A real clear problem statement or an opportunity statement that natural resource sector, so agriculture, mines, forestry, our environment ministry, needed to be more unified in how we do our work, in particular to work effectively with First Nations, but also to deal with this, how do you find solutions across those sometimes conflicting goals of dealing with reconciliation, environmental stewardship, and economic opportunities. There was, which is odd for government, but there was a quite an extensive review that was done of the performance of the natural resource sector. And as of April 1st of last year, the result of that review was a rebalancing of the portfolios across those ministries. The main one being a much more focused Ministry of Forests, which is to drive the transformation we want to see in how we manage forests and the future of that forestry sector. But then also this creation of a new ministry, Water, Land, Resource Stewardship. And we're sort of now past the point where we can call ourselves new, but it still feels pretty new as of April 1st. Just in terms of accountability, I think probably the key word here is integration. So we have a mandate there to really try to bring together the various interests to find solutions on the land base, and again for land and water and natural resource management. So often what you'll find is this is things like setting those objectives around how we're gonna, as a team BC and with partners, deal with land and marine environments. A big one right now is managing for cumulative effects, which I'm happy to talk about at length, but really a shift largely driven by specific court cases from First Nations, but also just the straight environmental imperative that permitting projects that try to minimize environmental damage piece by piece is still adding up to more threshold problems at an environmental level. And so how do we start thinking about, we need to have clean water, we need to be able to eat the fish, drink the water, and then track our land management backwards is, fundamentally the problem statement for the new ministry. And then we still have a ministry for Indigenous relations and reconciliation, but a lot of that on the ground advancement of reconciliation in terms of how we deal with environmental sustainability and economic opportunities is falling to the ministry. So, definitely still need to collaborate across the provincial family, but a clear role for a new ministry to advance these things. And I guess said in reverse, a recognition that in the past, no one person or entity was tasked with driving that change. And so these are some of the priorities, in the province. We look at minister mandate letters as setting the top priorities, the top political priorities that we move on. These are not all of them, but the big ones. So a big push on modernized land use planning, again, as a way that we can start tackling cumulative impacts. A real look at how we do permitting and authorizations across the natural resource sector. There's a first priority there of looking at housing, but that'll be a reform agenda that'll go for some time. Wildlife, species at risk, biodiversity. We've got an agreement that we're negotiating with Canada now on Canada, provincial, and First Nations approach for how to do that. Just made a commitment by the new premier to protect 30% of BC's land base by 2030, which is a commitment with Canada. But probably the one to flag for you is this new watershed security strategy and fund, which I'll come back to. Couple other ones important to me around a coastal marine approach and also a real prioritization around our work on wild salmon with First Nations DFO. So that's the kind of work plan, I guess I'd call it, for the new ministry. Within there, this is the list of divisions, just to give you a flavor of the kind of work we do. So driving some of the cross and our sector policies around reconciliation, natural resources. We have a support secretariat that provides those sort of common services for decision-making across ministries, a dedicated land use policy and planning group, which is also our big regional presence. And then we have a bunch of functions that support all those ministries, right? Our digital services, our cumulative effects, our corporate services. So there's a lot of core capacity here, which is intended to help all ministries. And then, only last, because I wanted to close on it, but my division really tasked with those leadership roles on water and other files. So just in terms of us, I've mentioned the strategies that we're working on. Again, all of these are really by nature. One is raising the level of effort for the province, a recognition that we haven't done enough on these issues. And secondly, setting out a clear provincial leadership role, but really trying to get kind of a Team BC approach and then a partnership approach with others across those. We have a variety of functions in the division that really look at, those areas of fisheries, water, and coastal marine stewardship. We have a fourth group actually, which I call our connective tissue, but really aquatic ecosystems on the ground, doing planning and projects that really knit all of those together. So that's a bit, for those of you interested in working with us, that's a bit of the toolkit we can bring to the table. So I think I'll end on this one, but just in terms of what's coming up. So again, under that reconciliation objective, one of the main things we've been working on since April is setting up collaborative tables with First Nations on these priority topics. And a big one for us is on the watershed work. We are on that second bullet. When we've gone to our cabinet on these files, they are provincial priorities to advance these. But interestingly, when we've worked with nations have done their own priority setting under the Declaration Act initiative, and they've also flagged watersheds as one of their top priorities. So there's a joint commitment that we're going to do this co-developed with First Nations. We're still going to do the work with agriculture, other sectors, local governments, the general public, but a real new approach to actually sit down and do that initial policy development together on these key files. Coastal marine strategies out right now. You can find that on the Engage BC website. We are very close to getting out a policy paper on the watershed, what a watershed security strategy could look like. And that will have the support of First Nations who've worked through that policy thinking with us right from a blank page. I would say that on the watershed security strategy, this is one of those priorities that are to be completed and launched by this mandate. So you should see a public comment period, I'm going to say in a matter of weeks, really going to look at getting sort of broad input and then getting into a very collaborative policy development process with partners and stakeholders, and of course with First Nations, and really intend to bring that in so that we can have decisions and launch that the fixed election date is November of next year. So really looking at making those key decisions by the end of the calendar year and launching in the new year. I should add, every time we say watershed security, I'm supposed to say and fund, but just to say that this is not just a set of policy priorities. There's a political commitment to having a fund that can actually resource our partners to do that work. And so we're working on those at the same time. I did want to put in a couple other flags, just the other types of things we're doing, but on salmon, which relates, salmon and watershed health are intrinsically linked. We have really driven partnerships with our colleagues at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and in August launched a renewal, which amounts to about 125 million for our Salmon Restoration Innovation Fund. And that's gone live. And then we've also completed some engagement on Marine Protected Area Network on the North Coast, which should be coming to decision soon, and will be the first marine protected area that has been co-developed and established, not just with federal and provincial governments, but also with First Nations. I don't know quite what happened there, but I got kicked out of the presentation, but I think I'm done anyways. So I thought that's probably good. I thought I'd just open it up and see if we had any time for questions or comments.
Okay, thank you very much, James. We have about 5 minutes for questions. You can see the background has just come up here, which has the Slido website for where you would go to enter your questions. And go there on your phone or on your computer and type in questions. If you have them, they will be fed to me and I will read them out as they come forward. So one that I have, which I guess as moderator I'm entitled to, is when you talk about the water security focus and that there would be funds for this, is there any connection to within the Water Act, the water sustainability plans? Is the ministry interested in moving those forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So just for everyone, so water sustainability plans, those are a tool under the Act that's actually never, has not yet been used. And one of the things with the creation of the ministry was actually, so a side story there is there's never really resources allocated to drive that work on the provincial side. So one of the things is we have absolutely that mandate, John, to try out those new tools. And as part of the new ministry, actually got dedicated staff to drive that work. We have one in development now in the Coxsila, and we have probably about half a dozen other ones where we're in early discussions across BC with on how those water sustainability plans, or figure out the right tool to the problem. A watershed security strategy, I could pretty much say a big driver is to move the focus from individual decisions up to a planning at a collaborative level with partners, so we can have more of those values trade-offs between food security, flow needs for salmon, drinking water, and try to get that those solutions done earlier up in the process. Yeah.
Well, there's one question right there at the top. So will the watershed security strategy include formal provisions for an agricultural water reserve? I certainly remember that this was a long conversation when the new Water Sustainability Act was being developed. So it's needed to maintain the agricultural land reserve, certainly in some parts of the province where you basically can't grow a crop without water. If you don't have water reserve for that, then the ag land reserve kind of doesn't work.
Yeah, so it's too early to predict what's going to be in the final strategy, but this is definitely the right topic to talk about. We have an ability, if we get a plan done, to have an agricultural water reserve within that plan. The problem is we haven't done it yet. So I think there's how should I put it? We're definitely going to ask this question as we go through. In our early work with the general public, food security keeps coming up as a real concern of British Columbians broadly. And so the need to figure out something that can work for our agricultural sector is pretty high. But what that'll look like at the end, if anything, I'd say if you have ideas, please raise your hand when we get out to comment on the intentions. And I'll just skip the collaboration with the Agriculture Ministry and getting those tools like water demand models plugged into how we do our work. That's for sure.
Okay, well, looking at the time, we could probably discuss the Columbia Basin Water Treaty for the rest of the time here, but I think we should move along. So thank you so much, James. Yep. And there will be definitely opportunities in the breakouts to continue some of these conversations, I expect.
Right. Thanks
we'll move on now to the Joanne Taylor's work. And so this work actually is part of a SSHRC, or for those who don't know the acronym, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which is a federal funding body, and it has a partnership development grant. And we secured some money from that program in order to explore the environment within which producers have to make their decisions, and that environment being the institutional environment, not the natural environment. So next slide, please. So the origins of this particular project actually came from one that we had going on before that. So Little Alderson Creek is a creek that flows into a larger creek called Fortune Creek, which is just northeast of Armstrong. And there was a proposal or an environmental farm plan, group plan developed with the objective of rehabilitating the stream channel. You see what it looked like before efforts to rehabilitate it on the right as part of a climate change adaptation strategy. The landowners were ready to work together, but what happened with this project is delays and uncertainties in communication, in the permitting required, and in the flow of funds led to the loss of landowner enthusiasm, and the project was never really completed. So that led us to think a lot more about what people had already been talking about, was what is this environment around the producers? A lot of research goes, okay, producer, what is it going to take to change your decision? But that doesn't exist in isolation. And so the objective of the Partnership Development Grant was to look at the role of this institutional environment and how that might affect the adaptation decisions that producers make on the land. Next slide, please. Now, as the research got going, things evolved. So at the beginning, our research question was, what are the social and institutional relationships and how do they impact on producer adaptation decisions? And how are adaptation priorities and decisions made? And our approach was to interview people who were involved in various aspects of this institutional environment. So we weren't just going to do another set of producer interviews. We were going to look at who was in that institutional environment. Well, after the first set of interviews, it became pretty clear that when you're asking people about the issues they deal with, a lot of them were related with water. And so the focus of our research shifted specifically to water regulations. And so the Water Sustainability Act and the regulations that follow from that, and the application of those regulations and how those impact on producer adaptation opportunities. So that's where kind of an introduction to the work that then Joanne almost exclusively did with the help of a couple other people on exploring this. And Joanne Taylor is a postdoctoral fellow who was working with me for the last while. And reading my notes here, I think I've covered everything. So I think I will just hand it over to Joanne right now, who can move on to her presentation.
All right, thank you for that introduction, John. I'd also like to make a note at this time that the data gathered for this project was done beginning in April 2020 and ended in early 2021. And I believe much has happened since this data was gathered and interpreted into the following results. So please bear that in mind. So this research project's overarching question asked whether the Water Sustainability Act of 2016 and its associated regulations is helping or hindering agricultural resiliency in the face of climate change. And what our research uncovered is that there is a disconnect of what is happening between policy and the delivery and applications of the regulations to agriculturalists. This presentation will elucidate some of those disconnects and hopefully provide some answers to this overarching question. Next slide, please. A brief description of our two research sites, which are the Caribou and Okanagan regions. These areas were chosen for their agricultural diversity. The Caribou is 80,000 square kilometers with a population of 62,000 people as of 2016. The predominant agriculture is mostly beef cattle, forage crops, dairy, sheep, goats, and small areas of horticulture. And water licenses in the Thompson-Nicola have not been issued since 1985. However, more water is available and allocation and licensing has not been enforced up north. The Okanagan covers an area of approximately 20,000 square kilometers, so much smaller, and has a population of approximately 315,000 as of 2020. So the density of population is much greater in the Okanagan. The Okanagan is the largest producer of wine grapes in Canada, tree fruits, and mixed vegetables in the South Okanagan. Agriculture is predominantly forage crops, dairy, cattle ranching in North Okanagan. Water is all mostly allocated now for agriculture and environmental flow needs. Licenses have mostly been allocated now. Next slide, please. There are two areas of key concerns for us in this project which overlap to create the problem we are trying to solve: the environmental and the societal. Environmentally, in the future, there will be increasingly drier conditions from what we're even seeing now, and water scarcity in both regions. Extreme water events such as flooding in the Caribou region, drought in the Okanagan. We've seen forest fires in both regions, pests, disease, and there is an increased demand for water and uncertainty about supply for agriculture in both regions. We must maintain flexibility in the face of water changes and prepare for the unknown. And we must be prepared to shift to new conditions and new crops and varietals in light of the above climate changes. Next slide, please, Asha. Socially, producers must comply with key regulations and policies that affect water use for agriculture, such as the Provincial Water Sustainability Act, water sustainability fees, rentals, charges, and tariff regulation. There are groundwater protection regulations, dam safety regulations and compliance, water district regulations, violation tickets and fines, and other regulations. Next slide, please. This slide shows the location of the interviewees. So the greatest number of interviewees was conducted in the Okanagan at 35, and that makes sense with the higher density of population. Secondly, we interviewed 19 people in the province in any location, and thirdly, 18 people were interviewed in the Caribou region. Next slide, please, Asha. This slide indicates the sectoral distribution of our interviewees across all areas in the province or in our two study regions. We interviewed 12 producers, 46 people from government, 4 from academia, and 9 Indigenous producers. Next slide, please. This slide indicates the producer sectors. So of the 12 producers, we interviewed 4 cattlemen, 2 forage producers, 2 dam experts, and 4 fruit growers of all types. Next slide. This slide shows the government sectors, and of the 46 government interviewees, we interviewed 5 from the federal government, 13 from Flynn-Rord, the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resources, the Ministry of Agriculture, 12. We interviewed 3 people from the Ministry of Environment, 6 from regional districts, 4 from municipalities, and 3 miscellaneous. Next slide, please. All right, now for the results. So we came up with 8 key themes from our discussions with participants, which are, I'll read directly from this slide. We found a lack of trust, education and communication, lack of flexibility, sociocultural barriers, resource prioritization of agriculture, time and expense, conundrums and lack of data and technology, and Indigenous agriculturalists. Next slide, please. Let's discuss the first finding, trust. We heard that producers share a social mistrust and suspicion of the government, possibly resulting in negative uptake of groundwater licensing. This is especially true within more traditional communities of ranching in older established ranching communities in both the Caribou and the Okanagan. All farmers stated that they are fearful of losing their water rights if they register their groundwater and apply for licenses. And in the process, they ask if their water rights to the existing water they now use will be taken away. And this is because if they demonstrate that they don't need that amount of water, then they no longer have the ability to expand their agriculture, which is a disincentive to collaborate and comply. And it was stated that Flynn Roar really needs to understand this. Some producers do not belong to producer associations for various reasons, perhaps because they just don't want to belong to associations. So they are generally not kept up to date on policy changes like the WSA, the Water Sustainability Act. So when it comes to registering or licensing wells, they simply don't know or they don't care. But if they want to access dollars for irrigation improvements, for example, through the EFP and the BMP, the Beneficial Use Management Fund, they must license, which for them is a conundrum. Ranchers believe that if they go to extension workshops, that they will be on the government radar, and they will then have to have their dam, for example, brought into compliance, which will cost thousands of dollars. Next slide, please. Finding number 2, we heard that more funding is required for education and communication on how and why the Act was rolled out and how it affects agriculture. We've also heard from participants that the licensing process has become so complex and complicated that non-compliance is occurring. Licenses have been given out on an ad hoc basis. However, there is no consistent pattern for issuing of dam licenses, and that there is not enough inter or intra communication or understanding between the ministry who developed the policy for the WSA and the ministry who administers the policy. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a big one, lack of flexibility. And we asked why? Well, interviewees stated that water authorization officers are looking at licenses in a subjective and piecemeal fashion, and implementation is not being conducted using a standard and consistent way. In other words, this process is vulnerable to the opinions of the individual water officer, or perhaps a consultant who is helping the producer with the application. The BC Ag Water Calculator was created for water management to adjudicate water, and it's based on climate data from 2000 to 2010, a very restricted time period, and which is now considered out of date. But there was more water back then than there is now, so the calculator does allocate more water for its specific crop. However, the data is not indicative of what is happening now or what will be happening in the future with climate change and its predictions. Furthermore, this modeling is not going to meet grower demands, especially if growers are being allocated water to beneficial use, as crop suitability is changing across the landscape. The beneficial use model is where a crop is allocated to water use and the license is based on this use, rather than the traditional water license issued to land and based on a forage crop, which is a high water user. The fixing of water to a crop now will not allow farmers to adapt to climate change in the future, where water demand may be higher for other crops. Even historical water users' water could change to the beneficial use model, where water is allocated based on the BC AWC, the British Columbia Ag Water Calculator, and that could be a decrease in water for them. In 40 years, growers will most likely be growing different crops, which means that they would have to reapply for a water license, and there's no guarantee that that would get the water that they need. Many of the historical water users, so the fit for licenses, the first in time, first in right licenses, as it's called in Canada, were given water based on forage, heavy water users. So they do have the availability and capability to change crop. One area that does have a bit more flexibility is purveyed water, which is different in that you just get an allocation for your water from your water purveyor, and there is much more flexibility for them. And this is especially true in the Okanagan and for tree fruits and grapes. Purveyors generally have much greater amounts of water allocated to them to allocate to water users. So that gives the grower room to change a crop and apply for more water. So there's flexibility there. Next slide, please. So we also found that there are sociocultural differences and barriers in growers' demographics. For example, there is sometimes language and technological knowledge barriers, which makes long online government application forms difficult to complete, for example, or English may not be a first language for some of our producer communities, or there may be a lack of knowledge in how to operate emails or computers for those online forms. Because of this, we heard that assumptions need to be reevaluated on multi-generational incoming farm families who have provided food and agricultural security for many years, if not generations, and that more support is needed in these areas of language and technology. Next slide, please. Currently, there is no funding within Flynn Roar, and I believe that ministry has changed its name, to assess whether someone is using unlicensed water or not. And perhaps someone could come by and turn off the water tap, but then you could just go and turn it back on after they leave. And this becomes this cat and mouse time-consuming game for both farmer and water officer. We heard that domestic water needs and ecosystem function include development, which is always going to be prioritized over food production in BC. And we asked, how is this going to be reconciled in the future? We have heard time and time again that agriculture is not prioritized by the government, which limits agriculture's ability to adapt and to be resilient in the face of climate change. Changing governments makes it hard to plan for long-term goals in agriculture. Authorization officers lack resources to look at licensing through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, legislation, which mandates collaboration and consultation with First Nations. And this was not happening due to the lack of resources and capacity to understand the UNDRIP legislation and sociocultural understandings of Indigenous peoples. Ducks Unlimited have traditionally worked with local governments, farmers, ranchers, and Indigenous communities to maintain ecosystems and dams for ducks and other aquatic species. However, Ducks Unlimited funding is severely declining from their private donors who are influenced by public opinion. People are becoming more fully aware of climate change, animal rights, and social justice issues surrounding colonial and traditional forms of sport hunting. Next slide, please. Participants also cited that their capacity to adhere to new regulations is expensive and time-consuming. Groundwater licensing, so for example, well water licensing, is especially having a rough time. Farmers stated that they see registering wells, sometimes up to $100,000 for new wells, and $5,000 to $10,000 for existing wells as more excess regulation and red tape. Second engineering reports are now required as backup inspections to the first report. And these engineering reports are can be anywhere between $5,000 to $10,000 on top of their annual storage fees, their volume fees, and their pumping fees. Dams must be inspected and upgraded if necessary every 10 years on low incident dams and can run sometimes between $75,000 to $100,000 to repair on a higher risk dam every 5 years. Next slide, please, Asha. We heard that climate change technology is lacking, and some climate change modeling data is available through PKICS, but it is just not being used by provincial water adjudicators. Lack of weather stations, hydrometric stations, and data does not receive enough funding, and government is not paying for transmission costs. Maintenance hardware must be in place for the next 30, 50, and 100 years to inform climate change science. Dam data technology is lacking for program development for water storage infrastructure in order to be able to do water balancing and budgeting for agriculture. More monitoring and data stations are needed for this. We heard that they cannot accurately predict current and future water supply, so licenses are not being granted due to the current data and models saying that we do not have enough water. Aquifer mapping is inadequate. Aquifer science is developing right now, but scientists are desperately in need of this type of mapping. Some of the reasons for the urgent need of aquifer mapping are that aquifers are intricately linked to surface water and groundwater, and that interplay between the surface and groundwater is critical. Okanagan aquifers are very shallow, unlike in California or Nevada, and society must ensure that groundwater pools do not get extracted. Next slide, please. Water authorization officers state that there is not enough staff and guidance for the staff, and that there is a lack of ability to engage with First Nations governments according to the UNDRIP requirements. Indigenous agriculturalists listed a plethora of reasons why agriculture is becoming increasingly difficult, and too many facets of those conversations cannot be presented here in a succinct and respectful manner. So we will be thoroughly addressing this topic in the final report. But as James said today, however, the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship is prioritizing Indigenous reconciliation and economic opportunities and how they manage sustainability and ag interests in their mandate. And I'm really looking forward to delving deeper and following more into the ways in which this is going to be actualized over time. I'm also looking forward to the policy paper on watershed security for the public soon, which Indigenous peoples co-collaborated. Thank you for sharing that with us today, James. Next slide. We come to key suggestions. We come back to our original question of whether the WSA, the Water Sustainability Act, is helping or hindering agriculture resiliency in the face of climate change. And what we heard from our participants is that it is not helping. With climate change, farmers who can't get the water they need say this is affecting the future of agriculture and food security. Agricultural resiliency is not being achieved because of water volume restrictions and lack of flexibility for farmers to change crops. Ag resiliency is not going to be achieved if dams are decommissioned or deactivated. We need more storage for producers in the Caribou region and not less. We must have collaboration between First Nations and the community of people of water users. There must be more inter and intra-agency communication, intersectoral, interdisciplinary communication pathways and tools. We must have integrated water management and integrated water resource management so that all producers and water users can have access to safe amounts of water allocation. We must have more extension in place, education, communication supports, and tools must be developed using current data that can help the water licensing adjudicators allocate water and licenses. Groundwater licenses must not be issued for the crop, but for higher water using crops so that there is a buffer in there for extreme hot days, and also flexibility in there for farmers to be able to change the crop if what they're growing right now becomes either no longer financially feasible or sustainably viable. Water ag reserves can be developed and are possible under the development of water sustainability plans. Further gap analysis studies must be conducted. The Polis Water Institute has released a document of information needs for developing water sustainability plans, and the Okanagan Basin Water Board is very interested in creating a water ag reserve. At least that was what our data indicated back in 2021. And we are going to go into that into the next presentation. However, environmental farm plan needs more funding in order to facilitate more supports in order to help agriculturalists make the steps needed to full licensing of groundwater. Communication must be increased so that trust can be built and to ensure that growers had and have all the information they need across all information platforms, such as mail and email. A provincial website is not enough. More workshops are necessary across the province in order for knowledge transfer to take place. Education must be increased, and we heard that we should put a moratorium on licenses until everything is licensed. And we come to our last slide. Data gaps. Along with the above key findings and suggestions, there is also the fact that storage on private land cannot be created, only on Crown land. So what can we do to map and create storage on private land when water will be extremely limited? What does the research say in the rest of the world? There isn't much research conducted on water reserves, but we will hear from the next speaker who is going to discuss what is happening this spring in Nevada, a novel approach. Thank you for listening, everyone, and I'm open for questions and answers.
Thank you, Joanne. So we're pushing our plan schedule a little bit. We can take a question or two. So we'll see what appears through Slido. In the meantime, anything that was particularly surprising to you, Joanne, when you were going through these interviews with these people in the environment that surrounds agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the findings were to be expected, but one of the biggest things that I noticed was the willingness of people to speak about water security and how that's affecting food security. Trust, the number one issue on our findings, or the lack of trust and suspicion, was a huge finding for me. But that is something that I think the social sciences research can uncover by speaking directly to people. So we have the scientific data, but the way in which that data and those results can be interpreted through the human lens was just really, really interesting for me, and I think our research team.
Great. Looking at the questions that are here, it's one thing certainly in our discussions is that we were looking to learn from more of that institutional environment that surrounds producers, as opposed to just doing another whole set of producer interviews. So I'm kind of answering the first question is our target was not producers as such. It was hearing the opinions of those people who interact with producers or who have some responsibility or connection to that that institutional environment that affects producers. And we weren't the scientists either. So I'm actually going to flip all the way down to the third question. And I think you commented on this a little bit already, but any further ideas or thoughts on this lack of trust? Like how do we get the regulators, the government, the producers to see themselves as partners who are trying to address the same challenge of how do we manage this resource, as opposed to the concerns that each has about the ability or willingness of the others to follow through on what's best for everybody.
Thanks, John, for reading that out. I really truly believe that collaborative governance is at the key. It is essential and critical, not only within our producer communities and the government communities, but between governments. So between nations, for example, between Canada and the US, we share a large watershed here in the Okanagan, the Columbia River Basin, for example. And I think that in order to develop that trust, we definitely need to collaborate with our Indigenous partners, with the government, with our producers is absolutely essential to keep that communication going. And I think that's the way forward.
Introduce our third speaker. So James Mack is with the natural resource manager for Eureka County in Nevada. So he manages research on the resource, monitoring and evaluation programs, including water resource monitoring, agriculture use, and rangeland monitoring. Is involved in planning and implementing policy at local, regional, and state levels, and in particular with the novel water conservation strategies such as the Diamond Valley Groundwater Management Plan in the Great Basin. So, okay, I've just been corrected. Jake Tibbitts, so it had been copied wrong. Okay, so sorry if I was confusing Jake. Yes, you are up next. So there have been definitely some interesting innovations down in Nevada that it would be great to hear about. And we're very happy that Jake Tibbitts is joining us today. And I will hand it over to you.
All right, thanks for the introduction. And it's great to be with you from the heart of the Great Basin. So I'm just going to jump right into it here. Before I get into the mechanics and the context of the Diamond Valley Groundwater Management Plan, I feel I should give a little bit of background of some of the issues we're trying to address through this groundwater management planning process in Nevada. So this is an aerial view of Diamond Valley. If you were to draw crosshairs on the state of Nevada, Diamond Valley would end up being pretty close to the center of that. It's very close to the geographic center of Nevada. It's a high desert area. It's internally drained basin. We don't have any river systems. We have very few perennial stream systems. Diamond Valley is the terminal basin of the Diamond Valley flow system. So there's many groundwater basins that drain to Diamond Valley. And if you look there at the north end of the valley is a large groundwater discharge area, or a playa. And then you can see all that agricultural activity that's going on there. All of those green fields are irrigated by groundwater pumping. In the 1960s, the U.S. Geological Survey, working with our state engineer who manages the water resources in Nevada, determined that the amount of water available on a perennial yield basis, that's the concept that we manage groundwater in the state, is this perennial yield concept. And that's the amount of water that's available perennially, that's always there. Mother Nature's providing on a year-to-year basis. And essentially it's the amount that can be sustainably extracted every single year without depleting the groundwater reservoir. And that is at 30,000 acre feet. And sorry, you know, us Americans, we work off that imperial system, so I'll be using acres, and I apologize for that. But 30,000 acre feet is the amount of water that's available each year. There's 26,000 acres under active irrigation, about 26,000 acres under active irrigation in Diamond Valley. That equates to about 200 circles. So if you were to count every one of those circles out there, most of the irrigation is through center pivot irrigation. But remember that value of 30,000 acre feet is available on a sustained basis. There's over 136,000 acre feet of water that have been granted for water rights for use. And about 130,000 of that is for agricultural use. So the large portion is for ag use. There's very many different reasons why it's been over appropriated. Part of it were the federal incentive programs that in the 50s and 60s for people to come out and get a little bit of feedback if everybody could mute.
Do you know which one you guys used to log in?
But anyways, the Desert Land Act is essentially what incentivized people to come to this area and stake up their piece of land for irrigation. And a very high percentage of them were successful. So when the state engineer was granting water rights, he essentially was banking on people being unsuccessful in their efforts. But electricity came to Diamond Valley in the early 1970s, and that helped people to be very successful in pumping groundwater. There's about 110,000 tons of hay that's produced each year, and very many millions of dollars of value. Most of the people that live in Eureka County get their water from Diamond Valley. So while we have this big ag base, we also have some mining activity, many domestic wells. The town of Eureka, which is the county seat for Eureka County, it sits in Diamond Valley. And like I said, about 2/3 of the population of Eureka County gets their water from this valley. So here's all the background I just provided. I won't go over that in any more detail. Part of the issue that we're having is because of the over extraction of groundwater for 50 to 60 years, we've seen some pretty substantial declines in groundwater there in the center part of the valley where the bulk of the irrigation is taking place. We've seen over 100 feet of drawdown. So these are the drawdown contours of the groundwater aquifer in Diamond Valley. So as we sit here, we are mining the resource. We're depleting the resource, and we see some pretty major declines in the water table. This is the water rights that are allocated in Diamond Valley. We do operate under the prior appropriation system, which I think I heard is similar to the first in time, first in right. That's what the prior appropriation is. So those that have the oldest water rights under the prior appropriation system have the ability to use all of their allocation of water in times of shortage. So what I've plotted on this graph are all the groundwater rights in Diamond Valley ordered by priority date. So on the left-hand side are the most junior rights, and then to the right-hand side of the x-axis are the more, so the senior to the left, junior to the right. And that red line across the graph is the perennial yield. That's the amount of water that can be sustainably extracted. So you can see that the large bulk of water rights in Diamond Valley fall above that line, meaning that they are junior. What's interesting, though, is the separation is very difficult to separate juniors and seniors, because you can see about 1960, there's a straight vertical line that goes straight up and down where the filings for water allocations during that period where it was kind of a rush to get those in. And the separation from some of the very most senior water right holders to some of the very most junior water right holders is literally days or just a couple months. And so before this process of groundwater management planning, many farmers in Diamond Valley thought that they had senior rights. There was always a thought that if you had a water right around 1960 or earlier, that you had water rights in good standing, meaning they were senior. And folks have found out along this process that they have some 1960 water rights that are actually very, very junior. So if the state engineer were to come in and curtail groundwater pumping by priority, by strict priority, that previous photo I showed you of all of those center pivot circles, you count for every 5 of those you see, 3 of them would go away. And so if you look at the socioeconomic impacts of that, that could be pretty dire for our community. So as we were looking at some solutions to help address this overpumping issue, the question came up, is there anything other than strict application of prior appropriation possible in Nevada in these overdrafted basins? And how about rewarding conservation? So part of the water law that we're under here is the use it or lose it concept as well. So somebody has the amount of water they're allowed to pump or use any given year, but if they conserve that water, there's no incentive to doing that because they actually may lose it. It would go to somebody else. So there were a lot of efforts that the farmers in Diamond Valley for many, many years, and in fact, a couple decades of working to try to find solutions, but we did not have the public policy, the laws in place, the regulations in place to allow really much flexibility other than strict prior appropriation and the use it or lose it concept. So we fast forward a bit to 2011, where our state legislature, for the first time ever, designated or put into our water law some flexibility to potentially operate outside of those concepts that I just discussed. And here's it's Nevada revised statute. I won't go in great detail here, but essentially it allows our state engineer to designate a groundwater basin as a critical management area. And if the state engineer designates an area as a critical management area, it essentially starts a 10-year stopwatch where that 10-year period will run. And at the end of that 10-year period, if he's required to regulate by priority, meaning coming and drawing the line and cutting the junior water rights off 100%. And that does include domestic wells. They fit into that priority system as well. But if you look at that section there, it says, unless a groundwater management plan has been approved for the basin. So that is the exception provided that it gives people a 10-year notice to get their affairs in order or to come get together as a community and develop a groundwater management plan to try to hold off that curtailment by priority. And the state engineer did designate Diamond Valley as a critical management area in August of 2015. So these 2 photos here is just to kind of drive home the example that if you look on the left-hand photo, you see a time date there of 2014, of June of 2014. That was before designation of the critical management area. And you can see the farmers, they'd get together. It was a smaller group of people. They'd wrangle. It was a facilitated process. They'd wrangle about some of their options. But when the state engineer finally designated Diamond Valley as a critical management area, we had to move our venue to the historic Eureka Opera House there on the right-hand side. And we started to get much more participation. It incentivized people to come to the table because they were under that 10-year time frame to do so. Part of the process to get a groundwater management plan approved is there has to be a petition signed by a majority of the holders of groundwater rights and submitted to the state engineer. This just shows some of the process to do that you see those various ways that a majority can be calculated. My point here is what I wanted to point out is that when the petition was signed for approval, once that majority was met, basically the farmers that were working on this process simply decided to get it submitted to the state engineer once that legal requirement was met. That's that majority percentage. And since then, there were a lot of people that just simply did not have the opportunity to sign the petition, or others have changed their mind, or there may have been sales of land, of farms since then. And it's been calculated very recently that the senior water right holders that today, as we sit here right now, 79% of them would actually have signed the plan. Our statute has very little about what can or cannot be in a groundwater management plan. It simply says that the groundwater management plan must set forth the necessary steps. That's all it says. And then when the state engineer is considering approval of the plan, these bullets here are all our water law says he has to consider. So there's nothing in that bill that passed in 2011 that says what you can or cannot have in a plan. So we are the only critical management area in the entire state of Nevada. There has not been another one that's been moved forward. So as our state engineers told us, as we were working on this planning process, he said, you are flying the airplane while you're trying to build it. We don't know exactly what can or cannot be in it. It was a facilitated process, and through that, typical with many plans, there's a vision statement here. You'll see that it focused on both the economical components as well as the ecological components and the socioeconomic, the social components of that. And of course, there were many goals that were developed, and I won't belabor those with you today, but I can provide more information if anybody has questions later. The scope of groundwater uses that fall under the groundwater management plan, it's just groundwater rights that serve an irrigation purpose, or mining and milling groundwater rights if they had their base right, they changed from an irrigation base right to a mining and milling. And early on in the process, it was determined that certain groundwater rights would not be part of the groundwater management plan. And the reason why is because if you total up all the groundwater use in Diamond Valley, it's over 95% of the groundwater use is irrigation or irrigation-based rights. And it just was not worth the political capital to bring in some of these other rights that simply did just, if you could spend a lot of time trying to address them, and it really didn't get you much benefit. There's other considerations that were in the plan. The water rights holders that developed it wanted to make it clear that there would be no out-of-basin transfers of water. That's a hot topic in Nevada where there's a lot of proposals. It's a dry state, and there's a lot of proposals for developers and others to pipe water across these basin boundaries to other areas. And so that was placed in our plan that no water under this would be severed and moved from Diamond Valley. And then the state engineer retains all authority to continue to address conflicts between water right holders on a case-by-case basis. So what the plan is it's a water market-based or a share system plan. The plan it's intended to incentivize conservation. So it actually rewards folks for conserving water. It allows unused water that you're allocated in any given year to be banked, and you can use that water in the future when it's needed. And then it also allows quick sales and leases and trades and bartering or whatever else between willing participants, private party transactions for people that need additional water to be able to work with their neighbors and to move water to different wells in a more flexible and streamlined manner.
Who made you the card with the picture of you and Don?
So the water shares were, this is the formula to develop that, where somebody's paper water right, the amount of water they were allowed to use was multiplied by a priority factor, meaning their seniority. So the very most senior groundwater right holder in Diamond Valley gets 100% of their groundwater right converted to shares. And then it's kind of a sliding scale down where the next person with 99% and it goes on down, where the very most junior person gets only 80% of their water right converted to shares. So shares does not equal the amount of water you get. Shares are used to determine how much water per share will be on an annual basis. So that's where we get into the annual or the wet water allocations, and that's the water per share. And that's where there's a set amount of water that's determined how much will be available on any given year. And then that volume of water is divided amongst the shares you hold, and people are allocated that wet water. There's a secure groundwater share allocation system set up for the market to allow the trading and the sale. You can only withdraw groundwater. It's like your bank account. Only if you have a positive balance in your account. Any unused water rolls over to other years. And then any unused water, any positive balance can be transferred to other people through willing party agreements and transactions. This, don't get tied up in the details here, but this table is in the plan. This is the allocation table that's part of the approved plan. And essentially, folks can look at this, and for estate planning purposes, for financing purposes, many farmers use their water as collateral for annual operating loans or refinancing. And this sets where folks know the amount of water they'll get in year 5, 10, clear out to year 35. So this is something they can use very strongly for planning purposes. I'm zooming in on this portion. This shows the reductions in pumping over time. There's a couple different scenarios here where for the first 10 years of the plan, the reductions are set in stone, essentially. And then after year 10, there's divergence of the amount that would be allocated out. And this is all based on groundwater monitoring and the response of the aquifer. So the state engineer after year 10 can ramp up the reductions or could slow them down if we're having positive responses and stabilization of our water table. There's every single meter to withdraw water under this plan. They have to have a highly accurate magnetic flow meter installed. These are smart, capable meters. We're in the process of seeking out some funding to convert every one of these to have basically a cell module on there to text data, so we could have a better tracking of water use. There's a locally elected advisory board that helps on the governance side of things. There's a locally based water manager where the farmers are assessed an amount of funding that they provide for this person to help basically for conflict resolution and to make sure that everybody's staying honest within the system. And that's all funded through an assessment authority in our state law. And then we have a very robust groundwater monitoring network because this is all based on trying to stabilize our water table. So we have annual measurements every spring they're going in, and then we have various wells that are equipped with pressure transducers where we are getting daily and sub-daily measurements of the water table response to different water management in the valley. There's other things being pursued as well in addition to this market-based system, including trying to find funding to purchase and retire water rights. Then that becomes a whole tangential series of events of what do we do with land that is no longer actively irrigated? How do we transition that to other valuable land uses? Working on managed groundwater recharge. You can see a host of things there. There's been quite a bit of reporting, if you haven't seen it already, on the Diamond Valley Groundwater Management Plan plight, and you can look at these links here, and I'll make sure this presentation is available for anybody that would like to look at it in more detail later. So what did we learn in this process? What I learned as the facilitator helping put this plan together is that folks have a hard time leaving their baggage at the door. And we had many, many meetings where we would have to rehash at the beginning of every meeting all the inequities of the past and the issues neighbors had with neighbors, and somebody used their water in a way they shouldn't have, and it just was on and on and on. And so we had to develop a list of assumptions, the things that we could place in the parking lot that we knew we're going to develop these assumptions and move forward. And this is the primary assumption here, is that the groundwater management plan, it does not address the inequities of the past. It starts from where we are and it moves forward to reduce pumping to sustainable levels. And once we could get this assumption on paper and everybody agreed to it, we were finally able to make progress. We also learned that changing minds is part of the process. You cannot change anything if you can't change your mind. And we had a lot of people that seemed to have some intractable positions when we came into this. So some came around to end up supporting the plan. There were some that were also part of the process that in the end did not support the plan. So we did learn, and we're surprised, honestly, by some people who we thought were very supportive of it, and in the end ended up appealing the plan and going through a legal process to fight the plan. Legal matters do matter. We didn't have lawyers in the room developing these. These were water rights holders and some technical experts to help guide, but we didn't have lawyers in there. And again, we had not very much guidance in our water law on what we could or could not do. And so there are these blind curves. You do not know what's ahead, and those legal matters will come back and are important. So of course, this plan was litigated. It was approved by the state engineer. It went through all the way through the Nevada Supreme Court. The local district court had overturned the groundwater management plan because of its violation of prior appropriation and beneficial use, or that lose it or use it concept. And it was a very narrow majority in the Supreme Court. So it was a 4-3. We have 7 members of that. It was the full court took this on. But the majority did find that this plan could, if you're a critical management area, could divert from the principles of prior appropriation. So what's needed and what's next? Well, we know that these dissents from the 3 justices do seem to align with folks that do not support the plan. So we have to keep those dissents in mind as we move forward, because those are going to continue to come to the surface as things that need to be addressed. And I can tell you that we have a legislative session starting here next week in Nevada, and there's already a pre-filed bill that's been filed to try to address some of these concepts for any future groundwater management plans in Nevada to have to do it a little bit differently than we did. Consensus is possible, but not unanimity. And we operated from the view of consensus is not everybody maybe raising their hand or signing their name on the line saying they support the plan, but having a plan that everybody can live with. And I do believe that's true. I really like this comic from Bagley, who's a political cartoonist. And, I crossed out Utah's water. You could pretty much insert anywhere in there, multiple interests, multiple stakeholders, a limited supply of water scarcity. And, there are some novel approaches to move forward in addressing some of those issues. And I hope some of what we've done here in Diamond Valley can give you some food for thought on maybe some opportunities that you can all address there. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Jake. That was a really great talk and an interesting solution arrived at by a group of people in a watershed that kind of reflects on some of what I think our Water Sustainability Act anticipated as possible, which was local water sustainability plans as they are defined in the Act to enable people in a local area to come up with something different than what our system, which is very similar to prior appropriation, would dictate absent an agreement in the local area. So the fact that people in Diamond Valley were able to come up with something, like it sounds like it was a challenging process to get there, but you got there. It's definitely, I think, food for thought here in BC. So it'll be interesting to see what questions people come up with. You mentioned a whole lot of baggage that was hard to leave at the door. Is there any single thing that just strikes you that just kept coming up again and again and again?
Yeah, one of the issues that continued to come up was the concept again of use it or lose it. And so there would be the neighborly disputes where in Nevada, our water law requires you to substantially use the majority of your water, in basically 5-year increments. And there'd be neighbors saying, well, my neighbor over here, I know he didn't use his water for 7 years in a row, and he's here at the table. He has all his water rights have been determined valid. He should have lost those years ago. So that was something that continued to come up. Or, folks the full square section of ground where people have their farm has water rights on it. But when people put a center pivot irrigation system in there, they're not irrigating those corners. And so that was another issue that came up where folks are saying, well, they're not irrigating those. They shouldn't have water rights on those corners. So that was, just that kind of rehashing of the neighborly disputes, I think will continue to come up over and over.
Okay. Yeah, fascinating for sure. So the top question we have here was every license holder included? So even the ones after 1960?
Yes, every water rights holder was included, we also, at the very beginning, before it was determined to exempt some of these other groundwater uses out, like domestic wells, municipal water rights, commercial water rights, some of those things, everybody was included because we were trying to narrow down the scope to make sure we were addressing what we needed to for sustainability. So yes, every water right holder was invited. No, it wasn't an exclusive group. And yeah, those before and after that 1960 cutoff were all at the table developing this together.
Okay, we also have a question here about measuring the effectiveness. You told us a little bit about how the level of the aquifer is one of the measures. Is there anything else that is being looked at to measure the effectiveness beyond just the groundwater level?
There's multiple things to measure effectiveness. Just on the enforcement side are we having to do any enforcement actions for people that are just not following the plan? So we know the plan is successful if there's not a lot of people trying to do end arounds, around it. And we have found everybody is following. There's very few enforcement actions, and even those enforcement actions that are coming forward, it's usually, not purposeful type things. But this is a plan to stabilize the groundwater resource. So groundwater monitoring is the primary thing that we are trying to meet. And so that's the effectiveness there, is whether or not we are stabilizing the withdrawals.
Kind of related to that, are all the wells, all the pumping wells monitored or metered?
Every single well is metered with a highly accurate Siemens magnetic flow meter. It's even down to the model. These meters were all, we narrowed into that model. They were all tested. Anybody that wanted an approved meter any manufacturer could submit their meter for testing. They have to fall within a very narrow range of accuracy. And then we do random checks on the various meters, or if there's red flags and maybe a meter is operating outside, a flow meter is outside of our established range of accuracy, we have some clamp-on ultrasonic meters, some other remote sensing tools to help fill in data gaps. But yes, every single well that is under this groundwater management plan, before they can even turn on their pump, they have to have this highly accurate magnetic flow meter installed.
Okay. I'm going to go to not the top question, but the one below it, which kind of feeds into the top question. Were there many concerns raised about introducing this market-based mechanism to allow reallocation of water between users?
So, sorry, can you repeat the question again?
So you've got a market-based system now that enables the movement of water between users. Based on what I heard, you can basically buy the right so that you can pump more and somebody else pumps less, type of thing. What sort of concerns were raised when this was brought forward as an idea?
So I did see somebody put a question in. There's this concept of what's called unbundling, like what Australia has done, where water is severed from the land as kind of a standalone right, where in Nevada, at least, that the water right is attendant to the land. It's recorded on a deed for a specific piece of land. So we grappled with that quite a bit in this process. And in the long run, the water right stays attached to a very specific piece of land, and the titling and the deed. The annual allocations, the amount of wet water provided in this account, those can be flexibly moved. So the water use can be moved freely around the valley. But if somebody wants to move the underlying right in which those allocations are granted, they have to go through the typical real estate transactions, the titling process, and all of that to do that. And that also includes them filing an application for that change with our state engineer. There's notice given, there's an opportunity for protest for people that feel that. So we kind of have this hybrid system now where the base water right stays connected to a piece of land, and it's now not this freely floating, unbundled right. That's how we did things a bit differently than has been done in Australia.
Okay. So the account you have, which is the flexible water, that's not tied to the land.
Right. So
Okay.
we really had to work on this to make sure folks really get this concept clear in their minds, is that there's a difference between shares and allocations. Your share is simply your entitlement to the amount of water that's available, and then the allocation given every year is based on how many shares. So the shares are connected to the land, to that specific title, that piece of land, where your allocation is then the amount of water placed in this account that can be freely used. But they have to go. They have to go to a well that has already been approved for use. So when I'm saying flexibility, it doesn't just mean somebody can go drill a new well and without some oversight of that or some analysis of how that would impair somebody else. So to freely move, you have to move to an approved groundwater well that's already gone through that process.
Okay. The next question below is kind of a follow-on. Sometimes water markets are talked about here in BC, and they don't get a whole lot of support. There's a lot of concern about things such as larger entities buying up all the water rights, and that makes it harder for smaller users to get what they need. Was that any kind of concern, or is there any observation of that happening? Are people buying up the land to get the water?
So in the context of, the global situation, Diamond Valley is a blip on the radar. 26,000 acres of irrigation. It's a very isolated area. We don't have any large cities nearby, but there was that concern about a large entity or developer coming in and acquiring all those rights and then moving them to a large, development or to the city kind of thing. And so that's where the water users wanted to check on that and saying, under this plan, there's no out-of-basin transfers of water. So that helped kind of address that concern that water would be leaving Diamond Valley and going to other places. But we have seen some folks that are trying to bolster their water portfolio because they know in years 15, 20 of this plan that they're going to be water short. So they are acquiring the underlying water rights to move into their portfolio, basically to pad themselves from these reductions later on. So yes, the water market is working in that way, that folks that feel that they will need the water later on, they're putting it into their account and banking it. So in the years where there's less water to be allocated, they'll be able to pull from those reserves.
Okay. And the next one on the list here speaks about how here in British Columbia, concerns about fisheries and stream flows and that are important. Now, you mentioned that there were springs that perhaps no longer exist. Was maintenance and even restoration of any of the natural or environmental services that heretofore would have been where groundwater was seeping to the surface Was that an issue at all in developing this plan?
Yes, yes. So that is a continual concern. Like I said, we don't have any river systems in Diamond Valley. Our perennial streams that host any fisheries are in the mountains, in the more perched water systems that aren't, those springs have not been impacted by the withdrawals of groundwater in our alluvial basin, our alluvial aquifers. But the valley floor springs, there's some substantial valley floor springs that have declined in flow and some that have ceased to flow altogether. None of those have ever had any fisheries or anything associated with it, but there are the ecological services that you mentioned. And so, yes, there are processes in place now to mitigate some of those issues. But that wasn't a big decision point for our water market. But I will say that with this, if somebody wanted to come in and acquire wet water allocations to allocate for environmental purposes, there's nothing that disallows anybody that has that interest from doing that. So this would allow folks that are concerned, would allow people to acquire water under this plan for those types of uses.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the clock here. We're down to the last few minutes. So I think we're going to call an end to the questions and just say thank you. But definitely that was a fascinating story that I think gives some thoughts to what might be possible or not. And BC, as was mentioned in the breakout group, BC is not California, BC is not Nevada. So we'd probably come up with something different, but the fact that you were able to get a group of people in a valley to come together and agree on a new plan, that has some reflections for what we're grappling with in this province too, where we've created the legislative tools to enable that, but so far there hasn't been any serious efforts to move forward. Maybe it's time for us to start thinking about that. And I really think your story was fantastic. Thanks as well, Joanne, for your summarizing of the work we have done. And hopefully there were some lessons there too and reflections. And thank you, James. Is James still here? For the ministry perspective. And thanks to everyone who attended. I hope that it was a valuable session and that you all learned something and that there will be food for thought going forward as we continue to grapple with the issue of water management in British Columbia.